In the spring of 1944, the most important lie in the history of warfare was being assembled piece by piece inside a network of offices, country houses, and radio stations scattered across southern England. It had a code name, Operation Fortitude. And the man who had to sign off on it, the man who had to believe it would work, the man whose soldiers would die on the beaches of Normandy if it failed, was Dwight David Eisenhower. He was not a spy, he was not a deceiver by nature. He was a soldier's soldier, a man who believed in logistics, in planning, in the honest application of overwhelming force. Now he was being asked to win a battle with ghosts. The Ghost Army had a name. It was called the 1st United States Army Group, FOSAG. It existed on paper, in radio traffic, in the imagination of German intelligence officers sitting in Paris and Berlin, trying to piece together where and when the Allies were going to strike. It had a commander, a very famous one the Germans feared more than almost anyone else in the Allied order of battle. His name was George S. Patton. Patton had no army. He had actors, inflatable tanks, fake radio operators sending false signals into the ether, and a carefully constructed fiction that the Allies were not planning to land at Normandy at all. The real target, according to everything the Germans were being allowed to see and hear and believe, was the Pas de Calais, the shortest crossing of the English Channel. The most logical choice, the obvious choice, which is exactly what made the lie so dangerous to tell. Because the Germans were not stupid. The men running German military intelligence in the spring of 1944 were experienced, suspicious, and operating inside an organization that had been penetrated so completely by British intelligence that almost every agent they thought they had in England was, in fact, working for the other side. They just did not know that yet. To understand how Fortitude worked, you have to understand what came before it. You have to understand a program so secret that it was not fully declassified until decades after the war ended. A program that Churchill reportedly called one of the most valuable assets the British possessed. It was called the double-cross system, and it was, in the simplest possible terms, the complete and total capture of German intelligence inside Great Britain. It began before America entered the war. German military intelligence, the Abwehr, had spent years recruiting agents, training them in tradecraft, providing them with codes and radio sets, and inserting them into England to gather information about British defences, industry, and military movements. What the Abwehr did not know was that British counterintelligence, MI5, had identified virtually every one of them. Some were caught at the border, some gave themselves up voluntarily, some were arrested and given a choice, and the choice was always the same: work for us. Send the messages your handlers expect, feed them what we tell you to feed them, and your life continues. Most of them chose to continue living. By 1944, MI5 was running 20 or more double agents simultaneously, all of them transmitting carefully crafted disinformation back to German handlers, who believed they were receiving genuine intelligence from their own network. The Germans were, in effect, paying for and maintaining an intelligence apparatus that was working entirely against them. The most important of these agents had a code name, Garbo. His real name was Juan Pujol Garcia. He was a Spaniard. He was not a trained spy. What he had was an extraordinary imagination, a hatred of fascism, and a talent for deception that bordered on the artistic. Pujol had first approached British intelligence before the war and been turned away, so he went to the Germans instead. He convinced the Abwehr that he was a committed pro-Nazi agent with access to British military information. They gave him a handler, a code name, and a salary. Then he went home and invented everything. Before he ever set foot in England, Pujol was filing detailed reports to his German handlers about British military units, troop movements, and coastal defences. Reports based on nothing, on travel guides, on library books, on railway timetables he ordered by post. The Germans believed every word of it. By the time British intelligence finally realized what this extraordinary Spaniard was doing and brought him into their network properly in 1942, Pujol had already built a fictional network of 27 sub-agents inside England. Sub-agents who did not exist, who had never existed, who were entirely products of his imagination, each with their own backstory, their own personality, their own area of specialty. He fed information to the Germans about each of them. He collected salaries on their behalf. He occasionally reported that one of them had become ill or had to travel for personal reasons, as an explanation for gaps in reporting. When one of his fictional sub-agents died, he reported it to the Germans with what can only be described as grief. The Germans sent condolences. By 1944, Garbo was the most trusted agent in the German intelligence network in Britain. His handlers in Madrid believed he was running the most productive spy operation they had ever managed on English soil. They awarded him the Iron Cross for his service to the Reich. What they did not know was that every single piece of information he had ever sent them had been written, approved, and sometimes constructed entirely by British intelligence officers working out of a house in North London. Garbo was the crown jewel of the double-cross system. And in the spring of 1944, he was about to be used to tell the most important lie of the entire war. The lie required infrastructure. You cannot convince an enemy that an army exists using radio signals alone. The Germans had aerial reconnaissance. They had agents, or thought they had agents, who could observe troop concentrations. They had analysts who tracked shipping, rail movements, fuel consumption, supply deliveries. They were looking for patterns, and patterns are created by physical things. So the physical things were created. In the fields of southeast England, in the area directly across the channel from the Pas de Calais, the Allies constructed the visible components of a fictional invasion force. Inflatable tanks, made of rubberized canvas, were positioned in fields and hedgerows where German reconnaissance aircraft would photograph them. From altitude, at the resolution available to German cameras, they looked identical to real Sherman tanks. Landing craft were assembled in harbors along the Kent and Essex coastlines. Some were real landing craft that had been moved from their actual staging areas to support the deception. Some were constructed from materials that would never survive open water but looked entirely convincing in a harbor photograph. Fake oil storage facilities were built along the Thames estuary. Fake military vehicle parks were laid out with the same spacing and organization as real ones. Fake field kitchens appeared alongside fake supply depots. The construction was overseen in part by a set designer named Norman Wilkinson and by Basil Spence, who would later design Coventry Cathedral. Making things look real from a distance turned out to require the same skills as making stage sets look real from the audience. The Germans photographed everything they could reach. Their photo analysts in Paris pored over the images. What they saw confirmed what their agents were telling them. A massive force was assembling in southeastern England, directly opposite the Pas de Calais. The force did not exist, but the most sophisticated part of Fortitude was not the rubber tanks or the fake harbors. It was the radio traffic. Modern armies produce enormous amounts of radio communication. Orders, logistics requests, reconnaissance reports, personnel movements, weather data, medical evacuations, supply requests. The volume of signals traffic generated by a single armored division in a single day runs into thousands of individual transmissions. The pattern of that traffic, its volume, its frequency, the units calling in and reporting, creates a signature as distinctive as a fingerprint. The Germans knew this. They had signals intelligence units whose entire job was to monitor Allied radio traffic, map the units producing it, and track their movements by following their signals. So the Allies gave them something to track. Fake signals units, composed of real radio operators transmitting fictional traffic, were positioned throughout southeastern England. They transmitted at the correct volume and frequency for the units they were pretending to be. They used the correct call signs, the correct operational procedures, the correct language and abbreviations. They made the traffic errors that real units make, because traffic that is too clean, too consistent, too perfect, looks like what it is, something constructed. The operators who ran these phantom transmissions were some of the most skilled radio men in the Allied forces. They had to be. A single procedural mistake, a single call sign used out of sequence, a single transmission that didn't fit the pattern, could alert German analysts that something was wrong. For months, they transmitted the ghost army into existence. Eisenhower knew all of this. He had been briefed on the double-cross system, on Garbo, on the full scope of Fortitude. He had approved it. He had integrated it into his operational planning at the highest level. And he hated depending on it. Not because he doubted it would work. The evidence that the double-cross system was functioning was overwhelming. British intelligence could read German encrypted communications through Ultra, the program that had broken the Enigma cipher, and through Ultra, they could track in almost real time what German commanders believed, what their intelligence was telling them, and what decisions they were making on the basis of that intelligence. What Ultra showed, in the spring of 1944, was that the Germans believed the deception completely. They believed Fusag was real. They believed Patton was commanding it. They believed the Pas de Calais was the target. The German 15th Army, the strongest formation in France, was positioned to defend the Calais coastline. The Normandy sector was held by the German 7th Army, an inferior force with fewer armored reserves. Eisenhower knew this because he could read what German commanders were writing to each other. What he could not control was what happened after the landings began. The deception had to survive D-Day itself, because the landing at Normandy, when it came, would tell the Germans something. It would tell them that Allied forces were hitting the Normandy coast. What it would not necessarily tell them was whether Normandy was the main effort or a feint, whether the real hammer was still waiting to fall at Calais. And if the Germans concluded, in the hours and days after the landings, that Normandy was the real invasion and Calais was the deception, they would move the 15th Army south. They would bring their best divisions to bear against a beachhead that was still fragile, still being built, still not strong enough to resist a major armored counterattack. The window of vulnerability was narrow, but it was real. Everything depended on whether the Germans could be kept believing the lie after they had seen the truth. This is where Garbo earned his Iron Cross. On the night of June 5th into the 6th, 1944, Garbo's British handler sent a message to his German contact in Madrid. The message was urgent. It reported that Garbo had obtained, through his network of sub-agents, highly reliable intelligence about an imminent Allied operation. The transmission was timed carefully. It was sent late enough that the German duty officer who received it could not immediately pass it up the chain. By the time the message reached senior German intelligence officials, the landings had already begun. The Germans were furious. Their best agent in England had given them intelligence that arrived too late to use. They questioned him. His handler, working with British intelligence, constructed an elaborate explanation. The agent who had gathered the information had been delayed in transmitting it. There had been a communications problem. It was not Garbo's fault. The intelligence had been genuine. The Germans accepted the explanation. More importantly, they kept trusting him. And then, on the 10th of June, 4 days after the Normandy landings had begun, 4 days after the most important amphibious assault in history had put 156,000 Allied troops on French soil, Garbo sent the message that may have decided the outcome of the entire campaign. He told his German handlers that Normandy was a feint, not in those words, in the careful language of an intelligence report from a trusted source. His network had analyzed the Allied order of battle and concluded that the forces at Normandy represented only a portion of available Allied strength, that the 1st United States Army Group under General Patton remained uncommitted, that the main Allied effort had not yet been delivered, that the Pas de Calais remained the true objective, and that the Normandy landings were designed to draw German reserves away from it. This was, of course, entirely false. There was no fusag. There was no Patton army waiting to cross at Calais. The Normandy landings were not a feint, they were everything. But Garbo was the most trusted agent in the German intelligence network. And what he was telling them was consistent with what they already believed, had been conditioned over months to believe, desperately wanted to believe. Hitler himself intervened. In the hours after the Normandy landings, German commanders in France had been requesting permission to release 2 SS Panzer divisions that were being held in reserve near Paris. These were among the best armored formations in the German army. Their commitment to the Normandy battle in the first 48 hours could have been catastrophic for the Allied beachhead. Hitler refused to release them. He was waiting for the real invasion. The 2 SS Panzer divisions sat in their positions while the Allies built up their forces on the beaches. They waited for Patton. Patton, who was in England doing nothing of military significance, who had no army, who was commanding a fiction. They waited for 6 weeks. By the time German commanders finally accepted that Normandy was the main effort and not a diversion, the Allied beachhead was established. The breakout was coming. The strategic window that Fortitude had been designed to create had been held open long enough to matter. The cost of the deception, measured in German decisions unmade and reserves uncommitted, was incalculable. The benefit, measured in Allied lives not lost on those beaches in June, was equally incalculable. Eisenhower understood both. He had stood on the tarmac and watched the paratroopers take off into the dark. He had written the letter accepting personal responsibility if the landings failed. He had made the call to go despite the weather, despite everything that could go wrong. What he had not been able to do was control what happened on the German side of the line. The lie had done that, and it had worked not because it was perfectly constructed, though it was extraordinarily well made. It had worked because of the cumulative effect of months of preparation. Months of rubber tanks and fake radio traffic, and a Spanish spy who had invented 27 people who did not exist and made German intelligence officers mourn them when they died. It had worked because of the double-cross system's most fundamental principle. A lie is not convincing because it is clever. A lie is convincing because the person being lied to wants to believe it. The Germans wanted to believe the main landing was coming at Calais. Everything in their strategic calculation told them it should be the shortest crossing. The most direct route to the industrial heart of Germany, the logical choice. Fortitude told them what they already believed. It confirmed their assumptions. It gave them evidence for what they had already decided was true. That is the hardest deception to resist. Not the unexpected lie, but the expected one. Not the story that surprises you, but the one that fits perfectly into what you think you already know. The men who designed Operation Fortitude understood this. They were not just constructing a fiction, they were engineering consent, giving the Germans permission to believe what they already wanted to believe, while denying them the contradictory information that might have forced them to question it. The real genius of Fortitude was not the rubber tanks. It was knowing what the enemy wanted to see and making sure they saw it. There is a detail about the weeks following D-Day that rarely appears in popular accounts of the Normandy campaign. As the battle raged in the bocage, as American and British and Canadian troops fought their way through the hedgerows and villages of Normandy in some of the most brutal close-quarters combat of the entire war, Garbeau continued sending reports to his German handlers. He continued maintaining the fiction that Fusag existed, that Patton was waiting, that Calais was the objective. He continued building the elaborate architecture of the lie week by week, transmission by transmission, fabricated sub-agent report by fabricated sub-agent report. And the Germans continued believing him. When German intelligence finally began to question whether Normandy was truly a feint, Garbeau's handlers fed them explanations. Patton's operation had been delayed but not cancelled. They believed this too. The full story of how long the fiction held and how much it cost the Germans in terms of misallocated forces and missed opportunities only became clear after the war, when German military records and interrogation reports of senior officers became available to Allied analysts. What those records showed was that German commanders who had spent the summer of 1944 holding their best reserves back from Normandy did so because they continued to expect a second landing at Calais. They did not expect it as an abstract possibility. They expected it as a near certainty, based on intelligence they trusted completely. That intelligence was entirely fabricated. The 15th Army, the formation that could have altered the outcome of the campaign, never fully committed to Normandy. It held its position for weeks, watching the Pas de Calais coastline, waiting for an invasion that was never coming. And while it waited, the Allies built their strength. Juan Pujol Garcia received the Iron Cross from Germany for services rendered to the Reich. He received the Member of the Order of the British Empire from Britain for services rendered to the Allied cause. He is believed to be the only person in the Second World War to have received formal recognition from both sides of the conflict for the same set of activities. After the war, he faked his own death and moved to Venezuela. He lived there quietly for decades. He occasionally gave interviews. He was modest about what he had done, describing it in terms that made it sound almost ordinary. It was not ordinary. The question that the Fortitude story raises is not simply about deception in wartime. It is about what it costs a man like Eisenhower to depend on something he cannot fully control. He was a general who believed in preparation, in planning, in the reduction of uncertainty through systematic effort. He had spent months organizing the most complex military operation in history, coordinating the movements of millions of men and thousands of ships and aircraft across an operation that had to succeed on the first attempt. And at the center of his plan was a Spanish civilian who was making everything up. The discomfort of that dependency was real. Eisenhower knew that the deception could unravel at any point. A captured agent who broke under interrogation, a careless transmission, a German intelligence officer who was simply smarter than the rest and noticed something wrong in the pattern. Any of these things could have ended Fortitude and with it, potentially, the entire operational premise of Overlord. He went ahead anyway, because the alternative was to cross the Channel without the deception, to land at Normandy with the 15th Army fully positioned and alert and ready to counterattack, and to see what happened to 156,000 men on those beaches without the 6 weeks of German paralysis that Fortitude had been designed to create. He went ahead because the risk of the lie was smaller than the risk of the truth. That is the calculation that commanders make and that historians sometimes clean up. The choice is rarely between a good option and a bad one. It is usually between two uncertainties, and the job of the commander is to determine which uncertainty is more survivable. Eisenhower determined that a world in which Fortitude failed was still more survivable than a world in which it had never been attempted. He was right. The Normandy landings succeeded. The beachhead held. The breakout came. By August 1944, Paris was liberated. By September, Allied forces were at the German border. The path to that outcome ran through a rubber tank in a field in Kent, through a radio operator transmitting fictional orders for a fictional army, through a Spanish spy in a house in North London, writing reports about people who did not exist, maintaining the most expensive and consequential fiction in the history of warfare, and through Dwight Eisenhower, who looked at all of it, understood exactly how fragile it was, and signed his name to it anyway, because the alternative was worse. That is the lie that made D-Day possible, not a simple lie, not a comfortable one. A lie that required the participation of thousands of people across 2 countries, that depended on the silence of every person who knew about it, that had to be maintained not just before the landings but after them, while men were dying in the hedgerows of Normandy and the Germans were still waiting for Patton to arrive at Calais. A lie that worked, not because of genius alone, because of preparation and patience and the willingness of men like Eisenhower to make the bet that the fiction would hold long enough to matter. It held for 6 weeks after D-Day. 6 weeks in which the German 15th Army stood at the Pas de Calais and watched an empty horizon. 6 weeks in which the Allied beachhead in Normandy became something the Germans could no longer dislodge. 6 weeks that changed the war. The lie held, and the truth followed it in. The complexities surrounding historical events often reveal nuanced factors beyond initial perceptions. Understanding the motivations and logistical challenges faced during significant periods, like the post-World War II trials, requires a careful examination of political and practical considerations that shaped outcomes.